In the frozen winter of 1944, when the war in Europe reached its most desperate point, American soldiers found themselves pushed into a corner they never expected. The forests of the Ardennes, once quiet and peaceful, turned into a maze of smoke, shattered trees, and distant gunfire. Young men who had left home with promises of returning soon now marched through snow that swallowed their boots, carrying memories of better days as they prepared for a battle none of them saw coming. Among these soldiers was Private Daniel Hart, a 22-year-old from Ohio whose calm eyes hid the weight of responsibility. He had joined the army out of duty, but he stayed because he understood that the world needed defending. On the first day of the German offensive, Daniel and his unit were cut off from the main force. Radios failed, roads vanished under snow, and they were surrounded by an enemy that seemed endless. The attack known as the Battle of the Bulge was more than a surprise, it was a storm meant to break the Allied line. Tanks rolled through the forests, their engines growling like beasts freed from cages. Daniel and his platoon held a small ridge overlooking a frozen river. It wasn't a strategic fortress, but it gave them a chance to slow the advancing enemy, even if it meant risking their lives for every inch of ground. Snow fell so heavily that it blurred the difference between day and night. Daniel remembered the warmth of home, where his mother would light lanterns during winter storms. Now the only lights were explosions painting the sky in colors no one wished to see. Supplies ran low, but spirits remained unbroken. The platoon shared whatever they had, water, rations, and stories that reminded them they were still human. On the fifth night of the siege, the enemy moved closer. Daniel heard the metallic clatter of weapons and the crunch of boots on frost. The thin line of American defenders braced themselves. Their commander, Lieutenant Mason, whispered that surrender was never an option. "If we hold this ridge," he said softly, "we buy time for thousands behind us." Time is a weapon too. When the attack began, it came like thunder. German artillery shattered the trees, sending splinters whistling like arrows. Daniel fired until his hands numbed. Smoke wrapped around the ridge, swallowing the world into gray murk. Yet through the chaos, the Americans refused to bend. They fought not because they were ordered to but because they believed the ridge mattered. Hours later, when the firing eased, Daniel crawled across the cold ground to check on a wounded friend, Corporal Lewis. The man's face was pale, breath sharp with pain, but he still forced a smile. "We're still here," Lewis whispered. Daniel nodded, though he feared the next attack would be worse. Their numbers had thinned, but their resolve grew stronger. A snowfall heavier than any before descended overnight. It coated fallen soldiers and remnants of shattered gear. Daniel stared across the ridge, realizing how small they were compared to the vastness of war. Yet he also understood that history was written in moments like these, moments where someone decided that giving up would cost too much. By dawn, scouts returned with grim news: enemy reinforcements were approaching. The ridge would be attacked again. Daniel tightened his gloves, feeling the cold bite through every layer. The lieutenant gathered the survivors and spoke with absolute steadiness. "Help is coming," he said. "We just need to hold a little longer." Those words became their anchor. When the next assault arrived, it was relentless. Enemy soldiers surged forward, shouting through the storm. Daniel fired from behind a shattered log, barely able to see through the swirling snow. The world felt reduced to sound, rifles cracking, artillery howling, men shouting commands that vanished in the wind. Every second felt stolen from fate. During a brief lull, Daniel realized their ammunition was nearly gone. The lieutenant ordered them to conserve every bullet. "Make each one count," he said. Daniel checked his pouch, counting only 9 rounds left. He felt fear pressing on his chest, but he inhaled deeply, remembering his father's words before he left: "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand anyway." As enemy troops regrouped, Daniel crawled between positions, offering help where he could. He bandaged a soldier's arm, shared the last drops of water with another, and whispered encouragement to those who doubted they would survive. Leadership wasn't rank, it was presence. And Daniel's presence kept hope breathing on that ridge. Then the enemy attacked again, closer than before. They threw grenades that shook the earth, forcing Daniel to dive behind rocks. He pressed his helmet down, heart pounding. When he lifted his head, he saw that their line had shrunk dangerously. The lieutenant signaled them to fall back a few feet to a more defensible point, a decision that might save their lives. Retreating seemed dishonorable, but Daniel understood that survival was victory too. They dragged the wounded through thick snow, refusing to leave anyone behind. The enemy pressed forward, shouting triumphantly, but the ridge still belonged to its defenders. Every step backward was a tactical choice, not surrender. Darkness arrived early, carried by heavy clouds. Daniel huddled beside Lewis, who was barely conscious. "Tell me something from home," Lewis whispered weakly. Daniel described the river where they fished as kids, the smell of summer, the laughter of his little sister. For a moment, the war faded, and two soldiers remembered why they fought. That night, Daniel spotted movement through the trees. At first, he feared another assault, but then he saw familiar helmets, American reinforcements approaching silently through the storm. Relief nearly buckled his knees. The lieutenant signaled the platoon to hold their fire as friendly forces reached the ridge, bringing warmth in the form of hope. The reinforcements brought supplies, ammunition, and medics. But they also brought news. The overall counterattack was preparing to launch, and holding the ridge had bought crucial time. Daniel realized their suffering had not been meaningless. Their sacrifice had changed the course of the battle, even if history never mentioned their names. With renewed strength, the Americans launched a coordinated defense. Daniel fought alongside fresh troops, feeling the weight of exhaustion lift slightly. The enemy pushed hard, but now the defenders had numbers, strategy, and momentum. The ridge that once felt doomed now held the promise of victory. During a fierce exchange, Daniel spotted the lieutenant struck by shrapnel. Without hesitation, he sprinted through bullets to reach him. The lieutenant's voice was faint but steady. "Keep them together, Hart." Daniel nodded, knowing leadership now rested on his shoulders. He rallied the men, shouting commands that cut through the chaos. They counterattacked, pushing the enemy back inch by inch. Daniel fired until his rifle clicked empty, then switched to a fallen soldier's weapon. Adrenaline carried him forward, but beneath it was something deeper, determination to honor those who had already fallen. Every step felt like walking through the memories of those who had believed in him. By afternoon, the enemy line began to falter. Daniel saw their formations break, heard their shouts of retreat carried by the wind. The ridge, battered and scarred, had been defended. The surviving soldiers collapsed to their knees, letting the reality sink in. They had done the impossible. They had held. Medics worked tirelessly to collect the wounded. Daniel found Lewis, who had been moved to a safer spot. Though weak, he smiled. "Told you we'd make it," he murmured. Daniel squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words. Not everyone survived, but those who did carried the memories of the fallen in their hearts. As reinforcements secured the area, Daniel walked to the edge of the ridge. Below, the frozen river glistened under a faint sun breaking through clouds. The landscape looked peaceful again, hiding the horrors of the night before. War had a strange way of changing places and people, leaving scars beneath layers of silence. News of the ridge defense spread through the Allied forces. Commanders praised their bravery, noting that their stand had delayed the enemy long enough for major reinforcements to mobilize. But Daniel didn't care about recognition. He cared about the lives saved, the friends who survived, and the sacrifice of those who didn't. In the following days, as the American counteroffensive gained strength, Daniel's platoon, what was left of it, was pulled back to a safer position. They slept in real beds for the first time in weeks, though sleep came with restless dreams. The war continued, but something inside them had changed forever. Daniel often wrote letters home, trying to explain what he had witnessed. But how could he describe the sound of bravery, or the weight of responsibility, or the moment when fear becomes strength? So he simply wrote that he was alive, and that he hoped to return home when the world stopped burning. Months later, when victory in Europe was declared, Daniel stood among crowds of cheering soldiers. Yet he remained quiet, thinking of the ridge buried under spring grass. The world celebrated freedom, but he remembered the cost. He felt proud, but he also felt humbled by the memory of those who never saw peace. When he finally returned to Ohio, he visited the river he had told Lewis about. The water moved gently, carrying reflections of the sky. Daniel realized he would never be the same person who left. War had carved new truths into him, about courage, loyalty, and the fragile beauty of life. Years passed, but Daniel never forgot that frozen ridge. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear the echo of distant artillery, the shouts of soldiers, the promise of dawn breaking over a battered world. He carried those memories not as burdens but as reminders of what humans can endure when hope refuses to die. And so, the story of Daniel Hart lived on, not in textbooks or monuments, but in the quiet strength he carried throughout his life. His courage, and the courage of thousands like him, shaped the world that followed. Their stand on that winter ridge became a chapter written in sacrifice, proving again that history is built by ordinary people who choose extraordinary bravery when the world needs them most.